Hey, good morning. This is Richard Chu. I'm the co-chair of the TMT Industry Group here at Shearman and Sterling. Today I'm very pleased to have as my guest JoAnn Covington, who's Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer at Rocket Fuel. JoAnn, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, JoAnn, let's start by asking you, well, first of all, how much time do you get to spend on privacy? Your title has a lot of different, you wear a lot of different hats, but how much time do you get to spend on privacy?
Not as much time as I would like. It is one of the most interesting areas of practice that I have. I love being involved in consumer privacy issues, particularly from the standpoint of an advertising company. But I don't get to spend as much time on it as I would like. In Rocket Fuel, we actually have a senior director of privacy who reports into me, who does spend 100% of his time on compliance with respect to consumer privacy, data protection, and similar issues of concern to advertisers around their inventory quality.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me a little bit about how privacy plays into the Rocket Fuel business model. Obviously, you're in advertising, but tell me a little bit about how privacy plays into that.
Sure, absolutely. Rocket Fuel is a technology company, and so to understand how privacy impacts our business, I have to tell you a little bit about how that business actually works. We offer a programmatic marketing platform, which is a technology solution that allows advertisers to purchase inventory at auction on huge exchanges. And we look at 100 billion opportunities per day to select advertising opportunities for any one of 1,000 campaigns that we're running on behalf of advertisers and their agencies. And in order to do that, we use what's called moment scoring technology. So an advertising opportunity presents itself. For example, say you wanted to look at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. There's a particular article of interest to you. In between the time that you load the page and the page appears in front of you with all the content completed, there are various advertising opportunities on that page that would have been put up for auction. And what we do is we look at one of those that opportunity before you, and we assess, is this an opportunity where we would want to show an ad? And a lot of opportunities, sometimes up to 40% of them a day, we reject because they don't meet our quality standards. But the ones that do, say, for example, you looking at an article on the New York Times, we would assess that opportunity and which advertising campaign that ad might be suitable for. And if we like it, then we would bid on it. Importantly, we decide how much we're willing to pay. And then if we win the auction, we earn the right to serve an ad, the advertising creative, on that page. And that's what you would see when you load the page. All of that happens within 100 milliseconds.
Wow.
Billions of times a day. Part of the information that we consider when we are determining whether to place an ad is, what do we know about the person who's behind the browser? Or at least we don't know anything about the person per se, but we have some information typically about the browsing history that's associated with that particular browser. Or if you're on a mobile phone, that particular phone ID for advertising purposes. We would assess that information, determine which ad might be suitable for you, and we call that interest-based advertising.
Tell me a little bit about the privacy issues that come up with that then.
Well, when a consumer sees an ad, for example, you're on the New York Times and you may see an ad for the purchase of a tennis racket, and you may have just visited, maybe in the last hour, maybe in the last day, a website that was selling you tennis rackets, and you would sort of wonder, well, gee, that sort of seems personally curated for me. Mm-hmm. How did that ad get there? Mm-hmm. Why is it there? Mm-hmm. And it may be there because you've got a cookie on your computer that history that you visited that tennis racket website may be something that is recorded and that we know and that we use in order to show you the ad. Mm-hmm. So we're collecting data, and often that data is collected anonymously. It's associated with a cookie on your browser, not with you personally, but it's recorded in our systems. And most consumers, they don't know who Rocket Fuel is. You know, we're an advertising technology company. We're a service provider to advertisers, publishers, and other first parties that have relationships with consumers, but we don't have a direct relationship with a consumer. So the opportunities for us to explain what we do, what the information is that we collect, and how we use it are very limited. And so often companies in our position get a bad rap, you know, as the silent tracker on the internet, someone who might be collecting data about you personally, and you don't have any idea or control over that data. And really what we do is highly beneficial to advertisers and thus to consumers. And that's the way that we want to be understood, and that's the way that we want to explain our value proposition to consumers. But because we're a third-party provider and we don't have that direct relationship with the consumer, conveying that information is really difficult.
So what kind of personal information do you collect, or do you not collect any personal information at all?
Well, it depends how you define personal data or personally identifiable information. We don't collect any data about consumers that you would typically traditionally consider personally identifiable information in the U.S. No address information, no email, no name, no telephone numbers, nothing that would be used to contact you as an individual. However, in order to serve an ad to somebody, we need obviously to know the IP address so that we can get the ad to the right machine.
Right.
We also, if you allow us to put a cookie on your machine, there's a profile ID, and that profile ID would have information regarding, the browser. You use Chrome, for example. You visited the tennis racket website. Maybe you made a purchase on a website where we had a pixel that would identify your behavior on that site that's then recorded in that browser activity. So we have some web browsing activity that's associated with that browser. So that's the information that might appear, and that information would be in the cookie for as long as you allowed the cookie to stay on your machine. And if you've allowed interest-based advertising to occur, that's some of the information that would be used to determine what kind of ad might be appropriate for you on a given website.
But you don't really know any information about the demographics of the person or anything like that, or their age or their sex or anything like that. Is that right?
No, but lots of other companies may. So, for example, there's lots of data companies, Blue Kai, which was recently purchased by Oracle. They gather data all over the web and create segments of consumers. And so if an advertiser wanted to use Blue Kai data segments, for example, we may associate data that's categorized and determined by Blue Kai or any other provider to say this cookie ID looks like it's probably somebody between 18 and 34, or this looks like a male, not a female, for example. And so we may associate certain data in that's used to make decisions on advertising. But it's all prediction by machines. The key is that there isn't any of that data that a human being is actually looking at in order to make those decisions. Remember, there are 100 billion opportunities, and each decision is made within 100 milliseconds. So it's all on the machine side, but very sophisticated modeling, as opposed to being really specifically curated for you. It's all machine learning and algorithms.
So under the traditional definition of personal information, it sounds like you really don't have any then. Is that?
That's correct. And we've designed our systems that way because we don't want to collect any information that's more than we need in order to make a good prediction about the relevance of advertising to a particular consumer at a particular point in time. So we actually go out of our way not to collect things that would be considered personally identifiable information.
So what are some of the challenges and or issues that you run into with the privacy? It sounds like you're more or less free and clear of it. I mean, where do you have thorny issues as far as privacy is concerned, or what are the things you kind of have to wrestle with?
Well, even though we're a business-to-business provider, right? We service other businesses, not consumers. Our first priority is the consumer. What we want to do is create a very positive consumer experience on the internet, because when we do that, that's good for our advertisers. Our advertisers are consumer-facing businesses for the most part.
Right.
So we care about making sure that their brand is well received by consumers that want to engage with it. And when we do that successfully, then that benefits the consumer, it benefits the advertiser, and it benefits Rocket Fuel as a service provider. And that advertising is the fuel, if you will. And we're the rocket fuel behind it that fuels the internet and all of the free content that's provided. So we really want people to understand how important advertising is to the internet and to the dissemination of free content on the internet. What we struggle with is making sure that people understand that we really don't have data that would be considered harmful. If there were a security breach, for example. And a lot of the data that we do collect is falling into the definition of what's considered personal data in the EU, or most recently...
like IP addresses,
IP addresses, for example, or even cookie IDs. Jessica Rich, who is the director at the Federal Trade Commission, we were very fortunate to have her come and speak to our trade association summit on privacy earlier this month in San Francisco. And she recently followed up with a blog post about her Q&A session with members at our summit and reiterated the FTC's view that personal identifiers such as cookie IDs or IP addresses can be considered personally identifiable information if they could be reasonably linked to a consumer. And similarly, in the EU, pseudonymous data, data that's not quite anonymous, but is used to sort of can be linked to an individual, also falls into the definition of personal data. When we have those identifiers that we typically use to anonymize data so that we don't have to collect more sensitive data about an individual in order to facilitate the advertiser's contact with them. If those fall into the same bucket and have the same protections as other types of personal data, we're not sure how exactly we would be able to fulfill those requirements regarding, the right to be forgotten, the right to access data and change it, and it's a conundrum, if you will.
Right. So just stepping out for a second in general for advertising, is there thought that it could be even more effective if it did have that personal information, or is the general approach with advertising, we really don't want to get that personal information. It doesn't help the quality of the advertising. I'm just curious whether it sounds like you don't have any, but I'm just curious whether is that kind of a struggle where the advertising industry wants to, maybe go in that direction, but because of privacy concerns doesn't want to, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it really depends where you sit in the ecosystem. So there are lots of providers online that such as social media platforms, Facebook, where they do have all of your personal information. And not only do they know exactly who you are and what your contact information is and who all your friends are, and they know exactly what it is that you're looking at on the internet. So if you're sitting in Facebook's position, I think Facebook would be saying to advertisers, this is very valuable information because I can connect you directly with Richard Shue, and I know exactly what he's been doing online, and I know exactly what he's purchased from you and when, and this is, valuable for you to advertise on our platform. For other parts of the ecosystem, sort of, the web in general, we look at inventory that's available on websites all over the internet, in addition to Facebook. You really don't need that level of personal information in order to have an effective advertising campaign. And what we really pride ourselves on is providing a very high return on investment for advertisers because our technology is so sophisticated. We can look at all of these different features, time of day, browsing history if that's available to us, website visited, how long you've been on a page, where you've been on a page. And from all of that information at that particular moment in time, we can determine what ad is right for you. And the reason we call it moment scoring technology is because it's beyond one-to-one marketing. It's not just the brand talking to you as the consumer. It's the brand talking to you as the consumer at a particular point in time. But the beauty of it all is we can make that feel curated to you without really knowing anything about you at all.
So you were saying earlier about how it's frequently misunderstood. What's the misunderstanding? That consumers think you know much more about me than you really do?
Well, exactly. So, for example, we have an opt-out from interest-based advertising because not everybody wants to receive ads that are relevant to them or that, might make people uncomfortable. So if you don't want that level of connection, you can opt out, and we would place a cookie on your computer that says, don't pay attention to the web browsing history on this computer when you're calculating when to show an ad. And we provide that opt out. Sometimes we have people write to us and they send us their email address and they say, please, remove me from your advertising lists, remove my information. And we have to write back and say, we actually can't do that because we don't have your email address. We have no way of knowing who you are. If you want to opt out of, our machine's collection and consideration of this data, you need to, place the opt-out cookie on the machine. And I think a lot of the, not hysteria, but sort of elevated level of concern around tracking, people misunderstand exactly when information is being tracked and how it's used. So, for example, in order to serve advertising, relevancy of data is really tied very closely to the recency of data. So on our back end, we don't have sort of long profiles of browsing history that are associated with IDs because
it's pretty irrelevant forever.
It becomes irrelevant, and so we don't keep it. If there's no activity with a particular cookie for more than 90 days, the data is gone. And you can also very easily get rid of the data yourself by resetting your own cookies at any point in time. So that tracking is entirely within the consumer's control, and it's not creating these long dossiers of information that often I think consumers are fearful of, that there's like a long file on them somewhere in the internet that really doesn't exist, at least not in our segment of the industry.
So it sounds like maybe consumers misunderstand it, but I mean, obviously sophisticated privacy advocates, privacy professionals, they must understand that. So I assume, I generally think they would not have that misunderstanding. Is that a general statement? Is that a generally accurate statement?
Well, one would hope so, but I think the technology is very confusing. I do think it is, and.
So do you find yourself having to explain things like this, that, hey, all we have is the IP address frequently? Is that something you have often explained a lot?
Well, absolutely. In some cases, the IP address is considered, personal data. So, for example, there's some jurisdictions in Europe where we avoid storing the IP address because it does meet the definition, or we believe that it's likely to meet the definition of personal data in certain jurisdictions. But in those circumstances, that makes it really difficult for us to do our job. For example, one of the things that's really important to us and to advertisers on the internet is fraud. And one of the ways that we use internally in our machine learning to identify potential fraud is the IP address. What kind of activity is coming from an IP address over time? And is that consistent with fraudulent activity or not? If we don't have the IP address, then we sort of put ourselves at a disadvantage. So I think there does need to be some exceptions, even if we say IP address is personal data and you couldn't collect it without consent. There has to be some exceptions, for example, to allow us in order to meet our security needs online. And the biggest trouble we have is if there is opt-in consent, for example, needed to place a cookie or to collect an IP address. Because we're a third-party provider, we don't have access to the consumer in order to get that consent in order to provide our service. And so that places us in a really difficult position,
But luckily you'd have the advertisers fighting that battle for you, so you probably don't need to worry about that, I'm assuming.
No, we do. We actually really do need to worry about that.
Well, let me ask you. Let's talk about because you were mentioning about the IP address and whether that's considered personal information. And so, tell me a little about how does that play into the GDPR and now the safe harbor is going down. I mean, how does that impact you as far as you being able to do cross data transfers or cross border transfers? I mean, is that a concern with you if IP addresses are considered personal information, or how that? Tell me about that a little bit.
I think we will need to work very hard to explain our business and make sure that the way that our business is regulated allows us to actually to perform the service. We're actually really excited about the GDPR. It would be nice, and we look forward to having a harmonized approach across Europe. One of the issues, though, is that pseudonymous data, so this data that's not personally identifiable data, is lumped in with personally identifiable data or personal data in the parlance of the EU. And so we're not really quite sure exactly what rules will apply to us on how we can use that data to provide our service. So we'll need to obviously work through all of those concerns.
Because you're really in that gray area, right? You don't really have traditional personal information, but it's not completely anonymous either. That's sort of the issue, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And we would like to do a lot more education around the use of the data. So, for example, and the storage of the data. So as I explained earlier, we don't need to store data for very long in order for it to be relevant to make an advertising decision. And we don't need to combine that data with any other personal information that can be reasonably linked to an individual. Mm-hmm. So, in circumstances where the data stands on its own and it's not linked to more personal data and is not kept for very long, we think that that's a very low-risk activity for a consumer, and less stringent rules should apply to the collection of that data, given the use cases.
Let's talk a little about privacy by design, which is a pretty hot buzzword these days. Sounds like you kind of already have that built in, but would you say that you're would you characterize the way you approach privacy as privacy by design, or do you not like that term? Talk to me a little bit about how your philosophy is on how you use privacy by design.
Absolutely. We are very, as I said earlier, very consumer focused, even though we're a B2B business. So we take into account how we use data, how long we need to keep data, what type of data we're collecting is very much a focus of the way that we design our system, and was since before I joined Rocket Fuel. The company started in 2008. And we also think very carefully about how our systems need to be designed if we are going to hold personal data or personally identifiable information, because we don't rule out that someday in the future the company may want to have more sensitive data, or that the data that we do have, as we've discussed, may someday be classified as personal data, such as, for example, IP addresses. And what will we do in those circumstances, and how could we make our system work effectively to deliver the service with additional regulatory constraints and obligations attached to it? So one of the first things that I did upon coming to Rocket Fuel was to have our platform, our advertising platform, certified as compliant with a set of standards that were designed to comply with the German data protection law, because we consider Germany to be one of the most, robust protection regimes. So we're compliant with those standards under German law, and we are compliant with the European directive, sort of overarching, and with with that, we also purchased a company in 2014 that's a data management platform for advertisers. So the first thing we did upon acquisition was also look at the way that platform worked and certified that for use in Europe as well under the standards as they currently exist and that apply to us. So we're very forward-looking and forward-thinking.
Tell me a little bit about, you were talking about earlier about how the algorithm that you use is, this milliseconds is all machine learning. The fact that, there really is no human intervention or human decision making or humans looking at this privacy, does that really ameliorate a lot of the privacy concerns? Do you find that people are more comfortable knowing that that's what's going on as opposed to, a person actually sort of looking at this information? Or how does that factor kind of cut into the privacy concerns of your business?
Well, one interesting fact is that, for example, if someone were to breach our database and take all of this data, it would look like nonsense to them because it's a series of numbers that's associated with the browser, and there's no personal or sensitive data that's attached to that. It's all designed to be read and accessed by our technology platform for its use. So I find that comforting personally. But I don't think that that's really well known or well understood, because it's not the experience of the person sitting at the other end of the screen. Right? And you often hear the examples of people experiencing ads that they didn't want to see because it was very personal information. There's the case that is always brought up about Target knowing that someone was pregnant before they did, because they started showing baby diaper ads based on their shopping history and things like that. We're part of an industry trade organization called the Network Advertising Initiative, and they have a set of standards that we adhere to. In fact, Rocket Fuel sits on the board, and we're very strong proponents of industry self-regulation. And one of the regulations that we follow is really with respect to sensitive health data. So we don't run advertising campaigns that require or would use categories information that we would consider sensitive health data, for example. I think with industry self-regulation, that's really the future, because as these technologies continue to develop and as consumers continue to experience them, the industry itself is best placed to come up with rules and regulations for really respectful business practices for consumers.
Right. Well, since all this information we gibberish to somebody, as a result, do you worry less about security, or you wouldn't go that far?
No, we worry a lot about security.
You worry about that anyways.
We worry about security anyway. Again, because, someday we might want to have personally identifiable information. I don't know when that would be, but we want to be ready for that. We also handle a lot of advertisers' information. Again, when advertisers use our platform for data management, we actually don't have any of their customer names and information. That's not the sort of data that we keep, but they rely on our systems being up and available to them, and that data being accurate and them being able to leverage it for their own advertising campaigns. So we're very careful with our security. We have a very extensive security policy.
You mentioned at the start of the show that you enjoy working with privacy. You wish you could spend more time with it. What is it about it that you like so much? Is it the philosophical side of it? Is it the legal side of it? What do you like about the privacy topic or area in general?
Both, actually. I love it because it's a really cutting-edge area of the law, and the technology keeps rapidly developing. The ways in which we can reach consumers and use data about consumers to deliver them relevant content, be it the primary content on the page or the advertising that goes along with it, it's mind-boggling how fast that's developing and changing, and it's very difficult for the law to keep up. So I love being on the cutting edge of that and helping to develop policies and practices that make sense for consumers and regulators and industry at the same time, and balancing all of those needs.
JoAnn, it's been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I learned a lot about privacy and advertising from you today. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
This is Richard Hsu and JoAnn Covington.